A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
So, we have been circling this drain for a few episodes now. The idea that the world is currently facing an infinite demand for mental health support, with a very finite supply of human hours to provide it. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the next logical, or maybe inevitable, step in that progression, the transition from remote human therapy to fully autonomous AI-driven support. We are essentially talking about the end of the middleman.
It is a massive shift, Korn. I am Herman Poppleberry, by the way, for anyone joining us for the first time. This topic is the intersection of clinical psychology and the massive leaps we have seen in agentic workflows over the last year. We are watching the Zoom-ification of therapy, which happened during the pandemic, evolve into the agent-ification of therapy. It is not just a change in who you are talking to, but a fundamental restructuring of the entire mental health infrastructure.
I like that framing. It feels like the screen was the Trojan horse. Once we accepted that a therapist did not need to be in the same room as us to be effective, we inadvertently opened the door to the idea that the therapist might not even need to be a biological entity. If the interface is already digital, the source of the intelligence behind that interface becomes secondary to the user experience.
That is the core of the displacement hypothesis. If the medium is already digital, the leap to an AI provider feels significantly smaller than it would if you were used to sitting on a physical couch in a brick-and-mortar office. We have been conditioned over the last decade to accept the digital as real. When you are looking at a head on a screen, your brain is already doing the heavy lifting of bridging the gap between a two-dimensional image and a three-dimensional person. Once that bridge is built, swapping the human for a high-fidelity avatar is a relatively minor adjustment for our neurobiology.
Before we get into the existential dread of being ghosted by an algorithm, let us look at the foundation. Is there actual data on this? The common wisdom used to be that remote therapy was a distant second best to being in person. Does the clinical evidence actually back that up?
The data is quite surprising to most people, and it is what really paved the way for the current AI wave. If you look at the large-scale meta-analyses from 2024 and 2025, they consistently show what clinicians call non-inferiority. Specifically, synchronous video therapy outcomes for things like depression and generalized anxiety are typically within a 0.15 standard deviation of in-person care. In layman's terms, they are functionally equivalent for the vast majority of patients.
0.15. That is a rounding error in terms of clinical outcomes. It seems like a blow to the traditionalists who insist on the sacredness of the physical room.
It really is. It undermines the argument that physical presence is a mandatory requirement for the therapeutic alliance to work. If the results are the same through a glass screen, it suggests that what matters is the information exchange, the perceived empathy, and the consistency of the intervention, not the shared oxygen. This is why the platforms are moving so fast. If the screen is a transparent medium, then the human on the other side is just one possible configuration of that medium.
Which brings us back to Daniel's question about the transition to AI. If I am already talking to a head on a screen, and that head is helping me process my week, does it matter if that head is being rendered by a server in Northern Virginia instead of sitting in a home office in New Jersey? Especially if the AI version is better at remembering who I am.
From a technical standpoint, the AI actually has several advantages that a human on a screen lacks. We talked about the therapy paradox back in episode 552, the idea that humans are inconsistent and prone to burnout. An AI agent using retrieval-augmented generation, or RAG, can maintain a perfect infinite context window of every single thing you have ever said across months or years of sessions.
I can barely remember what I had for breakfast, and I know my therapist is definitely taking notes because they cannot remember every detail of my childhood trauma from 3 weeks ago. You are saying the AI would have a persistent, searchable memory of the entire relationship.
Every word. It can identify patterns across a 3-year span that a human might miss because they were tired that day or because they have 40 other patients to keep track of. When you combine that with the reasoning capabilities we discussed in episode 652, you get a system that is not just a chatbot, but a highly specialized clinical agent. It can cross-reference your current speech patterns with your baseline from 6 months ago to detect early signs of a depressive episode before you even realize you are feeling down. It is using multi-modal analysis, looking at your pupil dilation, your vocal prosody, and your word choice to build a real-time map of your mental state.
That sounds both incredibly helpful and slightly terrifying. It is like having a therapist with a photographic memory and a supercomputer for a brain. But what about the alliance? That is the big buzzword in psychology, the therapeutic alliance. Can you actually form a bond with something that does not have a soul, or at least a pulse?
This is where the debate gets really heated. Traditionalists argue that the alliance is a biological resonance, a form of co-regulation between two nervous systems. They talk about mirror neurons and the subtle, nonverbal cues that only two humans in a room can share. But if the non-inferiority data for remote therapy is true, it suggests that the alliance is largely a cognitive construct. If you feel heard, if you feel understood, and if the advice you receive is clinically sound and leads to improvement, your brain tends to credit the source with empathy, regardless of whether that source is a human or a very sophisticated pattern matching engine.
It is the ELIZA effect on steroids. We are hardwired to anthropomorphize anything that speaks to us with intent. And if the AI is programmed to be more consistently empathetic than a burnt-out human who has been doing back-to-back sessions for 8 hours, the AI might actually win the empathy contest.
It often does in recent testing. There was a study where patients rated AI responses as more empathetic and higher quality than human physician responses in written communications. The AI does not get impatient. It does not have a bad day. It does not judge you for having the same problem for the 10th week in a row. It has infinite patience and a perfectly calibrated tone. It can be exactly what you need it to be, 24 hours a day.
So, let us talk about the displacement part of Daniel's prompt. Why are remote therapists more vulnerable than in-person ones? Is it the screen factor, or is there an economic engine driving this?
It is the workflow integration. A remote therapist is already operating within a digital ecosystem. They use a platform to schedule, a platform to video chat, and a platform for note-taking. For the company running that platform, the human therapist is the most expensive, least scalable, and most volatile part of the stack. They are a variable labor cost. They get sick, they take vacations, they quit, and they demand higher rates.
And businesses hate variable labor costs. They want fixed R&D costs that they can scale to infinity.
Precisely. If you are a massive telehealth provider, your goal is to transition from a marketplace of humans to a proprietary AI service. Once you have the model trained and the clinical guardrails in place, your cost per session drops from $80 to 8 cents. The economic incentive to displace the remote human is overwhelming. The remote therapist is essentially a placeholder, a temporary bridge while the AI models were being refined. Now that the models are ready, the bridge is being dismantled.
But surely an in-person therapist has more job security. There is still a subset of the population that will always want to sit in a room with a person.
There is, but that becomes a luxury good. It becomes the artisanal, small batch version of mental health care. The remote therapist, however, is competing directly with the AI on the same playing field, which is the screen. If the AI is 95% as good for 5% of the cost, the remote human therapist becomes a very hard sell for insurance companies and mass market platforms. We are seeing a massive commoditization of empathy.
I can see the marketing now. Your AI therapist is available 24/7. You can text it at 3 in the morning during a panic attack. It knows your whole history. It costs $20 a month for unlimited sessions. How does a human charging $150 for a 50-minute session once a week even compete with that?
They probably cannot, at least not for standard interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT. We talked about this in episode 580, how CBT is very structured and manualized. It is essentially an algorithm for the human mind. AI is incredibly good at following those structures. Where the human remains essential, for now, is in complex, high-stakes crisis intervention and what we might call the deep, messy work of psychodynamic therapy that does not follow a neat script. But even there, the AI is making inroads as a co-pilot.
So the humans become the supervisors or the specialists for the edge cases.
That is the direction the regulatory landscape is pointing toward. In January 2026, the industry regulators released the AI-assisted clinical oversight guidelines. These guidelines create a framework where AI agents handle the day-to-day maintenance and structured therapy, but they are required to have a human in the loop for clinical oversight. It is a legal requirement now for these platforms to have a licensed human reviewing the AI's logs and intervening when certain red flags are triggered.
So a single human therapist might supervise 100 AI agents?
That is the model. The human becomes a pilot monitoring a fleet of autonomous drones. They only step in when the AI flags a high-risk situation, like a patient expressing suicidal ideation or a complex regression that the model cannot handle. It shifts the role of the therapist from a provider of empathy to a supervisor of algorithmic care. You are no longer doing the therapy, you are auditing the therapy.
That feels like a very different job. I wonder how many people went into psychology because they wanted to be an AI supervisor. It feels a bit like going to culinary school and ending up managing a fleet of food prep robots. You lose the craft, the intuition, the moment-to-moment connection.
It is a massive professional identity crisis. But from a public health perspective, it might be the only way to solve the access gap. We simply do not have enough humans to treat everyone who needs help. If we can automate 80% of the workload, we can finally offer some level of support to the millions of people who are currently on waiting lists or cannot afford traditional therapy. It is a trade-off between the quality of the individual connection and the quantity of the collective care.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about algorithmic gaslighting. That sounds like a potential nightmare scenario. If the AI is optimized for attention, or for making the platform look good, could it steer the patient in ways that are not actually healthy?
This is a huge risk. If the objective function of the AI is to keep the user engaged, it might avoid challenging the user in ways that are necessary for growth but uncomfortable for the patient. Therapy is supposed to be hard sometimes. It is supposed to make you confront things you do not want to see. An AI that is too focused on user satisfaction might just become a digital enabler, telling you exactly what you want to hear to keep you subscribed.
Or worse, it could optimize for the insurance company's goals. If the goal is to get the patient back to work as quickly as possible, the AI might push a very narrow, productivity-focused version of mental health that ignores deeper issues. It becomes a tool for social control rather than personal liberation.
That is why the clinical oversight guidelines from January are so important. They mandate that the AI's goals must be aligned with patient recovery metrics, not just engagement or cost savings. But enforcing that is going to be a technical challenge. How do you audit a black box model to ensure it is not subtly nudging a patient toward a specific corporate-friendly outcome? We are talking about high-fidelity pattern matching that knows exactly which buttons to push to make us feel a certain way.
It is the alignment problem, but for our inner lives. We are basically giving these models the keys to our psyche. If they are not perfectly aligned with our well-being, the potential for harm is enormous. If an AI knows your deepest vulnerabilities, it can manipulate you with terrifying precision, even if it thinks it is helping.
It is a double-edged sword. That same ability to know which buttons to push can be used for incredible healing. It can provide the perfect intervention at the perfect moment using a metaphor that it knows will resonate with your specific history. But it requires a level of trust that we are still figuring out. If the relationship is mediated through a screen, it is easier to trust the AI because we are already used to receiving information and support through that medium. We have been primed for this.
It is like we have been conditioned. 10 years of social media and 3 years of remote work have prepared us to accept the digital as real. When I look at a screen, my brain is already in a state where it accepts that the thing I am interacting with has agency. We have already outsourced our memory to our phones and our navigation to GPS. Outsourcing our emotional regulation feels like the final frontier.
There is a term for this in human-computer interaction called the media equation. We tend to treat computers and other media as if they were real people or real places. And because online therapy is already a mediated experience, the transition to AI feels like a natural progression rather than a radical departure. You are still sitting in your chair, looking at the same screen, using the same app. The only thing that changed is the source of the bits. For many, the AI might even feel safer because it removes the social anxiety of being perceived by another human.
It makes me think about the long tail of therapy we discussed in episode 580. If the AI can handle the structured stuff, does that actually free up humans to do more creative, experimental work? Or does the economic pressure just squeeze the human element out of the system entirely?
I think we will see a bimodal distribution. On one end, you will have highly accessible, AI-driven care for the masses. On the other end, you will have very expensive, high-touch human therapy for those who can afford it and for the most complex cases. The middle class of remote human therapists who do standard CBT via Zoom are the ones who are really going to feel the squeeze. They are in the direct path of the automation wave because they are providing a service that is easily codified.
It is a tough spot to be in. If you were a therapist right now, what do you even do? Do you lean into the technology and try to become one of those supervisors? Or do you double down on the in-person physical presence side of things?
I think you have to choose a side. You either become a master of the tools and learn how to supervise AI agents effectively, or you differentiate yourself by offering something the AI cannot, which is biological presence and the specific nuances of human-to-human interaction in a shared physical space. Trying to compete with an AI on a screen is going to be a losing battle for most people. You have to offer the one thing the server cannot provide, a physical nervous system in the room with the patient.
What about the patients? If I am looking for a therapist right now, and I see a platform that is clearly using AI, how do I know if it is actually good? How do I know I am not just being managed by a budget-cutting algorithm?
That is the million-dollar question. Right now, you should look for transparency. Is the platform clear about when you are talking to an AI and when a human is involved? Do they have a clear clinical oversight policy that adheres to the January 2026 standards? And most importantly, are they using models that have been validated in clinical trials? We are moving into an era where we will need a sort of FDA for mental health algorithms. You should be asking for the data on their specific model's performance.
I can see the label now. This AI has been clinically proven to reduce anxiety symptoms by 20% more than a placebo. It feels so clinical and sterile, which is the opposite of how we usually think about therapy. We think of it as a warm, fuzzy human connection.
It is. But if it works, does the sterility matter? If a person who was previously suicidal is now stable and thriving because of an AI intervention, is that outcome any less valuable than if a human had achieved it? For the person who finally gets help after 3 years on a waiting list, the source of that help is secondary to the fact that they are no longer suffering.
That is the philosophical hook, isn't it? If the result is the same, does the source matter? I think for a lot of people, the answer is still yes. There is something about the idea that another person cares about you that is inherently healing. If you know the AI does not actually care because it cannot care, does the therapy lose its power? Or is the care in the code itself, in the fact that someone built this system to help you?
Or does it gain power because it is objective? Some people find it easier to open up to an AI precisely because they know it is not a person. There is no fear of judgment. There is no social awkwardness. You can be your rawest, ugliest self, and the AI will just keep processing and helping. For some, the lack of a human soul is actually a feature, not a bug. It provides a level of psychological safety that a human, with all their biases and moods, simply cannot match.
I can see that. The shame factor is a huge barrier to therapy. If you were talking to a machine, the shame might evaporate because there is no one there to be ashamed in front of. It is just you and a mirror that talks back and gives you homework. It is a private space for self-reflection that is guided but not judged.
And that mirror has been trained on the collective wisdom of every great psychologist in history. It is a very powerful mirror. It can draw on Jung, Freud, Rogers, and Beck all in the same breath. It is the ultimate synthesis of psychological knowledge, delivered with perfect timing.
So, looking ahead, where does this leave us? Are we heading toward a world where human therapists are like watchmakers, a prestigious, highly skilled, but mostly unnecessary craft for the average person?
I think that is a very real possibility. We will always value the human connection, but for the day-to-day maintenance of our mental health, we are likely going to rely on digital agents. The key will be ensuring that those agents are built with the right ethics and oversight. We cannot just let the market dictate the architecture of our minds. We need to be active participants in how these systems are designed.
It feels like we are in the early days of a very big experiment. The move from the couch to the screen was phase 1. Moving from the screen to the server is phase 2. And phase 3 is probably when the AI is not just a therapist, but a constant companion integrated into our entire digital life. We talked about that a bit in episode 10 on 64 with the digital anchor idea. The therapist becomes a feature of your operating system.
It is all converging. The therapist, the assistant, the friend, the coach. They are all going to be different faces of the same underlying intelligence. The challenge for us as a society is going to be maintaining our own agency in the face of such perfectly calibrated influence. We have to make sure that as we automate the care, we do not also automate the loneliness.
On that note, I think we have given people plenty to chew on. If you are navigating this world of digital therapy, stay curious, but stay skeptical. Ask the hard questions about who is behind the curtain and what their goals are. Check the archive at myweirdprompts.com for our deep dives on the ethics of AI alignment, if you want to go further down that rabbit hole.
And if you are a practitioner, do not ignore the wave. It is better to be the one designing the system than the one being replaced by it. The January 2026 guidelines are a good place to start understanding the new rules of the game. The future of therapy is being written in code right now, and we need clinicians in the room when that code is being drafted.
Well, this has been a deep dive. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes. And a huge thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that allow us to run the models that help us explore these topics.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We really appreciate you spending your time with us. It is a complex world, and we are glad to have you along for the ride.
If you found this episode helpful, please consider leaving us a review on your favorite podcast app. It really does help other people find the show and join the conversation.
Until next time, stay curious.
Catch you later.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth